thank our good friend Tom Daijo Redden, who will be talking to us about what a Buddhist politics might look like in the United States in the post-Trump era. And I think many of you might know Tom or Daijo. I think he's going to want to go by Tom probably for this session. Tom's got a PhD. He's a priest in the Zen Peacemaker lineage, practices in Massachusetts, and related to Green River Zen Center. And he's taught at the college level and began practicing with Bernie Glassman in 1980. So it's a real delight to have Tom bring his expertise, his experience, and his deep study of some of these topics to us. We'll have plenty of time, Day, and Tom and I spoke yesterday, and it's not out of the question. He may have changed his mind, but generally, I think Tom's going to break up into two sections where he'll speak for a bit, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So if a question occurs to you, we really want to stimulate questions and dialogue. So please, write this down, and when we get to the question and answer portion, then we can entertain your questions. So with that, Tom, I'm going to hand the talking stick. Actually, I have a talking stick. Here it is. There's the talking stick.
Well, I want to say to everybody, I'm truly honored to be here today. I want to thank you for being here. And I want to especially thank Jeffrey O'Keefe for his kind invitation and his sparkling personality that made all of this very easy. And I especially want to thank Miyoshin Moto Sanchez, who's one of the staff persons at ZPO, and she was an absolutely stellar communicator and organizer and prompt with everything. And I've been grateful for that. So basically, I want to talk for about a half an hour to start about the Buddhist politics, sort of traditional view of Buddhism, and take some comments from you all, questions, and then move to more contemporary sort of engaged Buddhism today. And so the question that I'm looking at is, what would politics in the United States look like if we applied Buddhist principles to them? And one may say, well, we don't live in a Buddhist country. This is not Burma. This is not Bhutan. It's not Sri Lanka. This is the United States of America, Judeo-Christian country, traditionally. And I think the basic premise here is that the present political, economic, ideological system that drives our lives here has worked for some people quite well, for others not so well. You probably know the social statistics around violence and around poverty and around homelessness, and I don't think we need to go into them right this moment. But the point is, it doesn't work for everyone. And the question is, what type of alternatives? And I think it is true. I'm a political scientist by training. I've been teaching history and politics. I've lived all over the world. I've been grappling with social issues for the last 40 years. And, I'm not the only one. It's clear that climate change is literally that single existential question that confronts us. And the question is, what the heck do we do about it? Because it's almost overwhelming for most of us to sort of even grasp, let alone figure out what to do about it. It's clear, Joanna Macy talks about the great turning. Either we can go on as business as usual, we can deny it, Donald Trump and other folks, you literally erase it from government documents and from government information, or you actually face it. One of the precepts of Zen is that you face reality. We do not turn away, as Susan Moon talks about. And so if we're looking at reality, that we are looking at an existential situation, the question is, what alternative might we think about? Buddhism is one such approach. And as a practicing Buddhist, I do this not only for political reasons, but also for the fact that the more I learn and have learned about the Buddhist politics, the politics of the great teachers through the ages, the more I understand the Dharma. And so it's both a very political and it's a very social situation for me. And so the other piece here I want to share is the fact that I am working on a book on this topic. I dabbled in it off and on when I was teaching full-time. I'm no longer teaching full-time as a college professor. But when I was teaching, I wrote a couple papers a year. I did a certain amount of research. The last year and a half, my college has closed. I'm turned 100% toward this. And so in the next 2 or 3 years, I trust this book will come out about what a Buddhist politics what might look like. And the basic premise is this, is that if we are to survive, if we are to thrive in the world today, we need something like a politics of compassion, what I would call, and others have called a Buddhist politics, what many people call a politics of compassion. It may not have to be Buddhist, but the point is that we are not only taking care of ourselves, we are taking care of others at exactly the same time. And at the end of the talk, the model that I will emphasize is the Bodhisattva model. And one can argue that, the argument here is that what we're really looking at for the future is a Bodhisattva politics. We try to become as awake as we can ourselves in order that we can serve the world more effectively. Now, I have to emphasize that this is not a Dharma talk, okay? This is more of an academic class. And at least in our Green River tradition, Dharma talks have very different, they have a little bit different emphasis, a little bit different flavor. So this is more of a traditional, let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. I will tell you, and then I'll tell you what I told you. So this is, anyways. So the challenge of applying Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha Dharma, to 2021. Needless to say, time and space separated us from the time of the Buddha. Language separates us. A simple word like dukkha, the first noble truth. Life is dukkha. How many Asian teachers say it doesn't translate? Paulo Rahula, in his book, What the Buddha Taught, he gives about 12 definitions because it's so deep and it's so varied. And so if we can't even sort of get our heads around a simple fundamental idea such as dukkha, there are challenges about other things, but we proceed nonetheless. So I want to make that very, very clear. We also have to separate ourselves from the myths of the past. The historical record is very, very thin. The Buddhist canon was not written down until about 300 or 400 years after the Buddha died. Of course, there was an oral tradition throughout the entire world, including India at the time. They were probably very proficient at it, passing down word for word. They had incredible memories, many of them. But the point is that a story changes over time. John Strong, scholar, wrote a book about King Asoka, right? 100, 150 years after the Buddha died. And the title of his book is The Legend of King Asoka. And he makes the point is, we don't really know what he was like. We have his pillars that told us, but that was in his words. The point being is that we do the best we can given what they're presenting. So I want to exercise the most humility as I present this. Number one, I don't read Sanskrit. I don't read Pali. I'm not a Buddhist expert. I don't have a PhD in philosophy, as a lot of the sort of eminent writers. Bernie Glassman talks about, this is just my opinion, man. For me, this is my impression of this all. The other thing I want to say before I forget is I, of course, bring my own perspective. I think most of you can probably see me at this point. You see, I'm a white guy, right? I'm in my mid-60s, and in this country, which means I am a person of great privilege. I have been a person of great privilege, that things have come my way that I may or may have so-called earned, but clearly I never forget the fact that as a heterosexual male with a certain amount of education, doors open for me and other doors don't close for me simply because of what I look like. And that's just a fact. So anyway, so the question is, and this is a debate, was the Buddha political? Now, Richard Gombrich, who's an Oxford scholar, is a real heavyweight in early Buddhism. He says no. Was the Buddha political? No, he says. And I quote him here, I do not think that the Buddha took a serious interest in politics or intended his teachings to have political consequences. He states the Buddha's message as pure soteriology, meaning it was all about salvation, meaning nirvana. He says his teachings were directed toward establishing the Sangha and directing everything toward individual salvation, not society. And he says, do not call the Buddha socialist, whatever you do. Now, many contemporary writers disagree with that position. And in many ways, I'll get to that in my opinion. Trevor Lynn in his book, his title gives away his feeling, the Buddha, the social revolutionary potential of Buddhism. The social/revolutionary potential of Buddhism. And I quote Trevor Lynn, the teachings of the Buddha are not concerned with the private destiny of the individual, but with the concern with social and political models. It's not the destiny of the individual, he says, but with the social and political matters, and these receive a large share of the attention of the teachings of the Buddha in the Pali text. Now, my basically opinion here is I can argue it both ways, but the point is this. I'm interested in what the Buddha's teaching tells us about politics. And let me give a definition that political scientists have gone by for a long time. One is, again, this is deep in the last century, Harold Laswell, a Yale professor. He said, politics is the process that decides who gets what when in society, who gets what when. And what that means is, if you think about it, okay, healthcare, who gets healthcare? 29 million Americans don't have it now. You know, Obama got 20 million Americans healthcare as a result of Obamacare. Who gets what? Healthcare. When do they get it? Some people, oh, now they have it. Other people, they just 2.2 million people have lost it in the last 3 years. Who gets what when? You know, do you go to the public hospital and wait 4 hours when you broke your arm? Or do you go to your private doctor and get it right away? So that's a definition. A second one, which I find is interesting, is by David Easton, University of Chicago. He says, politics is a system of deciding the values that are authoritatively allocated, the values that are authoritatively allocated in society. All you have to think about, the Trump values, Barack Obama values, they're very different and they have very different implications. And so I think it's safe to say the Buddha had a real impact on the allocation of values, especially in the Brahmin system that we'll talk about in a bit, because he really rejected a bunch of it. At the same time, he accepted a lot of what, the social norms of the day. The implication is that when you have values, make decisions on that have an impact on people's lives in terms of who gets what when. Okay. Now, so let's move toward the background of the Buddha. And my sense of this is that we cannot understand the Buddhist teachings unless we understand the world that he comes from. And I have to tell you, I didn't know much about this time in India or early Buddhism before a year and a half ago when I started to read this. And I have to tell you, I find it just the most compelling topic imaginable. I find it really quite remarkable. And I never knew, So let's look at this. I trust that this is pretty clear for you. Is it clear? Can you give me a thumbs up? Is that okay? All right, thanks, Jeff. And so there are a number of things that we want to look at here. So this is India, as you can see, it's called the Mahajanapada, which is a political term for great states. It's like great powers, if you will, great nation states. But let me talk about a few things about the Buddhist time. Number one is that India is a fairly insular place. I mean, you can look at the Himalayan mountains, and if those of you have been there, they're like when you step into the Himalayas, you are literally stepping into a different world. If you look, and so basically what happened is that throughout history, it's believed that those who came to India came from the south, probably from Africa, and then came from the Middle East, the sort of first inhabitants, and came this way. Now, the folks that we're going to talk about, the Aryans, who become the dominant force in ancient India, and in fact, what they create the foundation of Hinduism, and therefore the foundation of Indian social system, is that they come down through here, but we'll get to that in a second. The other thing that we want to recognize is just how much water there is in northwestern India, as well as the Ganges River Valley, which is here. This is where the Buddha lived his life and traveled. So let's just quickly take a walk, if we will, in terms of history. And so what we have here is that from like about 330 BCE to 1300, let's say at 2000, 1300, there was what was called the Indus Valley Civilization. They were the Harappan people, and they were in and around this area here. They often talk about the 7 rivers. And the interesting thing is that we have not been able to translate their language. They have had a few hundred seals that demonstrate like a certain amount of writing. We don't know much about them. And so this was what was called the first urbanization. This was the first so-called civilization, traditional definition of civilization in India. And what happens is that from around 2500 or about 1500, so this is basically as the Indus Valley civilization has declined, and it could have been from regional climate change, it could have been flooding. It seems that it's not because of warfare. We just don't know, really. Is that the Aryans came down from the steppes of Central Asia. They came down to Iran. The tribes called the Aryan tribes, they described themselves as the noble people. And they split off in Iran. They went through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then into northwestern India. And it's interesting that the language, again, this is a language group. It's not color, it's not culture, it's language group. And the other tribes, they went westward, and that became the Indo-European language group. So our language, English, French, Spanish, etc., Italian, we have a similar roots to the Indian languages today of Pali, of Sanskrit, of today, of Hindi, etc. So anyways, what happened early on is that there was a civilization and it basically collapsed. And people spread out throughout the north, coming down to the south. There's a so-called, anyway, I won't go into that. Anyways, and then what happened though is that things tended to get dry, it seems, and people gravitated further and further to the east. And what they found is a phenomenally fertile part of the world because of this river system. And again, every year you had the melting of the Himalayas. You also had the monsoons from about June to till about October, and flooding everywhere, the soil. So these were the Great Plains, the Great Gangetic plains here. There are Great Plains over here. So this was ideal farming. And so what happened, and we'll just walk through this sort of sociological period, is that what happens during this time is that there's the discovery of iron. And the discovery of iron takes place right in this area called Magadha. Magadha becomes the center of early Indian politics, early Indian economics, and in fact, early Indian religion, at least part of the religious traditions. And this is the part, and so let's just walk a little bit here. So the Buddha grew up, and I'll come back to this map, but let's go, to the next one. Look at this. Wow. So you can see on the left here, here's the detail. You see the Ganga River, and if you had a chance, I had been to Bodh Gaya, I've been to this part of India. Today, it tends to be very, very dry, not many trees. And I was just shocked to read about how different it was in the day. And again, for our purposes, the belief is that the Buddha was born in Lumbini here, and that he spent most of his life in Kapilavastu. And yet what happened is that he spent his teaching life from Savatthi, which was the capital of Kosala, and he traveled around here. Varanasi is on the Ganges River, very, very intense place if you ever get a chance to go there. remarkable place for pilgrims are all around India. And this is, again, this is the area of the Buddha's life. I come down here to show you, these are some of the different places. Bodh Gaya, very interesting place, very intense place where the Buddha was. Here we are, Bodh Gaya, was enlightened. One of the amazing things is that his first talk right here, the first turning of the wheel at the Deer Park, we're talking 160 miles. Imagine 160 miles on very rough roads, limited resources. And so, the amount of physical endurance required for the Buddha to teach 45 years and the struggles, getting sick, heat sickness, all the rest of it, I think is something for us to really appreciate. The fact that when you talk about life is suffering is the fact that life was incredibly difficult at this time. So what happened during early India, right before the Buddha was born, is that in this region around Magadha, the capital at that time, or now it's called Rajagaha, in Nalanda, some of you may be familiar with the great university, Buddhist university in the day, when it may be one of the earliest, if maybe the earliest in the world. But basically what happens is that they discovered mines. And with the mining came the ability to make tools such as axes and plows. And so what happened is that in this part of India, they began to chop down the forests, and the forests were formidable. There were places where you could get run over by an elephant, tigers could come after you, the snakes were poisonous, they were dangerous in terms of thieves and robbers. Slowly but surely, with with this new technology of an axe. I mean, think about the difference between copper and an axe. And so what happened at this time, before the Buddha was born, is that the iron is discovered and they cleared land. Therefore, agricultural production increased dramatically and the population increased dramatically. Those of you who have taken a look at Irish history, and I'm no expert, but when Ireland first got a hold of the potato from mainland, within 100 years, the population grew by 2 or 3 times, simply because people ate more and more nutritious food. And rice was that food for this part of India. And so what you had is this huge increase in agricultural production. And with that comes trade. And with the trade comes towns. And with the towns comes cities. And so what happened is that you have what's called the second urbanization in ancient India. The first one was way over in the Indus River, and the second one is in this region here. The other thing that's important for us to recognize is that the trade routes between this very dynamic place, and again, the center of gravity at the time of the Buddha is in this part of India. And what happens is that there is this trade route that goes up through here and literally goes right through Kapilavastu, where the Buddha grew up. And so the story is that what's called the North Road, not surprising, the North Road literally went from, south, but basically it went from I don't want to move that, up from Magadha up, and it goes literally right through the town where the Buddha grew up, and then it continued. And so it continued up to, the other part of India. So, the Buddha's about here. So it's up, all the way to, this is the next great town, Taxila. And there's even the theory, although it's not proven, that the Buddha, because he grew up a rich kid, he and other young elites got an education in Taxila, which was the preeminent, supposedly the preeminent educational place in his day. But we really don't know. But it's not impossible. Anyways, the point being is that this becomes an urban center, and there's a huge amount of trade, and it goes literally right through Kapilavastu. Now, one thing that's very important is the fact that the Buddha grows up on the fringe. He's on the periphery of the center of East Indian life. He's like in the out country. And so he's sort of from this rural area but it's on the road. And it seems like he's really not probably exposed to, although he probably had a good education, if in fact he didn't travel to Taxila, he probably had a pretty pretty provincial education. Anyways, so what happens here is the fact that the Buddha grows up in this environment. And what happens is that Brahmanism, which is the dominant religion and social system that spread from the Aryans and goes right across into especially this part of India down to the south. But the Buddha probably did not grow up with a strong Brahmin influence. But in his 6 years of search on the path before his enlightenment, there's no question he became very, very familiar with it. So let me go back to just a couple things about Brahmanism. And in terms of religion, there's basically the early Vedism, which was very much focused on the gods, on fire sacrifices, on ritual. And they were carried out by the priests. The Brahmin priests were the top of the four castes of the day that were developed that the Aryans created and perpetuated. They were at the top of it. And so and over time, that Brahmanism, which was very ritualistic, fire ceremony was important. You had Brahmanism. And Brahmanism takes place, some of you have heard the Upanishads, the Vedantas. They were the last of the Vedas. The Vedas were these hymns that were passed on orally. And so what happened is that over time, Brahmanism, or I should Vedism, transform into Brahmanism, and they embrace and they develop some of the main thinking of what we know of as sort of Indian religions. And this is around 1500 BCE. And most of this takes place before the Buddha is born. And that consists of the idea that there is, there's this universal energy, Brahma, there is Brahman, there is the Atman, the soul, there is karma, there is reincarnation. And so these were the dominant sort of viewpoints at the time of the Buddha. And so what happens is that as things change and as people move to the east and as urbanization develops, there is also a challenge to the Brahmin system. The Brahmins, again, that have the priest on top, you have the warriors, the governing class next, and then you had the farmers and the merchants, and then you had the servants, and then you had the Dalits or outcasts and others, slaves at that time. And so what happened with the second urbanization is there's a new class on the scene. And this new class are the merchants. And these merchants, not only do they have wealth, and often more wealth than the Brahmin class, because of the second industrialization, because of this incredible growth in trade, they are able to make claims on society. It's like what the middle class did in feudalism in Europe. The traders of the early merchants in feudalism, they were the ones who were demanding more of a say in feudal society in relation to the clergy as well as the aristocracy, and the middle class helped bring about democracy and capitalism and other things like that. And to a certain extent, in India has this reformation. And so what happens in India is that you have this movement, and this movement has to do with the what were called the heterodox. These were the new religious movements that opposed Orthodox Brahmanism. And the Brahmins were committed to a village culture in which they had their place. Families were committed to it, the 4 stages of Hindu life of, as a youth, you study, then you get married, you have material pleasure, physical pleasure, then you retire, and then you become something of a spiritual person, completely spiritual person before you die. And so the village life is where that took on great prevalence. And so what happened in the urban centers, though, and again, this is classic, is that people in the city do not trust urban people because their life is fast, there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and things are just different there. And so what happens is that you have this emergence of a group called the Shramanas. And these were the traveling ascetics. These were the so-called traveling philosophers. These were the folks who rejected family life. And there were supposedly, and there were all these individual teachers who led them. Some source says there was as many as 62 different teachers around that time. And the Buddha happened to be just one of them. We have to recognize that at this time in India, the Buddha was one of many, like dozens and dozens of teachers. And so what happens at this time is that the Buddha is one of these teachers. He comes to be the most prevalent. His main competition is the Jains. And as a result of that, he has to create a very distinctive following. And so let me just move to the Buddhist Sangha. And there are two pieces of his politics I want to talk about. Number one has to do with the politics of his particular Sangha and the politics beyond that. And the politics of his Sangha sort of go like this. And in talking about the Sangha, what happened very early on, the Buddha was enlightened. He met his five, former colleagues, if you will. They became his disciples, and very quickly, 60 of them become his disciples. And in a matter of months, he eventually gives his talk 160 miles away from Bodh Gaya in Deer Park. But to his disciples, he basically says, I want you to become missionaries for the good of the world, for the welfare of the world, for the good of all, for the salvation of all. I want you to go forward and go forward individually to spread the Dharma. And basically, Buddhism becomes a missionary religion, if you want to call it that, at that time. And so the Sangha, as his followers grow and grow, the Sangha becomes, as his followers grow, he's got to figure out where they're going to live. In the very beginning, they slept under the trees or in caves. But in time, the numbers became great. The Buddha got complaints from local people that they did not want. It was disrespectful for his disciples to be traveling during the rainy season because they were killing crops. They were disrupting the agricultural system. And that is in part what led to the beginning of what become monasteries. The monasteries are financed by some of these very, very wealthy people. And they're a place where the disciples can stay during the rainy season. And over time, the Buddha develops the rules for the monasteries. And again, the idea is how to create an environment in which people can achieve enlightenment. The other piece about this is that we always want to remember that the Buddha was in competition day and night with other teachers. The Jain teacher Mahavira was a very, very powerful person. He is said to, and the Buddha had 6 years of a journey. This guy had almost 13 years. He was much more strict than the Buddhists. He was also from closer to Magadha, and he was sort of the home hero that people enjoyed. So the Buddha was always aware of how his monks were doing in relation to others. There's one reason why they cut hair. The Jains they didn't cut their hair at all. The Jains often didn't wear any clothes. The Buddhas decided his monks had to have robes, and they had to be a particular color. Early on, they took the rags from the carnal, the burial places or the burial grounds, the charnel grounds. But eventually they had to become orange or ochre, whatever that color is. So what happens is the fact that, the Buddha had bowls to distinguish themselves from other folks there. There were some of the other groups, they used the skull of individuals. So there are all sorts of different ways that people operated. But the point being is that the Buddha came up with an extensive set of rules. The monks, of course, had 227, I guess. The women, the nuns, eventually had 311. And again, the issue of sex is pervasive in all of this. I'll talk about women briefly in a bit. But the point is that this is a highly sexist, highly, in many ways, misogynist society in terms of how women were treated. From the Brahmin point of view, women were to be controlled by their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, and then their sons. They were not to be independent. And I'll just jump ahead here in terms of, women and the Buddhist Sangha. Some of you know the story. It took Ananda 3 times. Ananda, the Buddha's #1 disciple for many years. He said, no, I don't think so. Second time, no. And then third, his mother-in-law, his stepmother, finally helped convince him. And so, but the point is that the Buddha was always sensitive to local concerns. To go be too radical around women as a pragmatist. And I argue that his politics were very practical. You can call them revolutionary, but they were also very pragmatic. He didn't want to get too far out in front of local people. And as many of you know, the Sangha, the Buddhist community, was dependent on the lay society for their resources. And so a lot of the rules of the Sangha, in effect, changed dramatically around clothes, around gifts, around food, around what kind of, should they wear sandals? Should they wear sandals with 1 string or 3 strings? The level of detail is really significant. But the point being is that the Buddha becomes this leader in this very, very competitive environment and has to find his way. So his own Sangha politically was very much based on where he came from. Kapilavastu, if you remember the map is, again, he's up on the fringes of society. Where he lived, they were not, where he lived up here, again, he came from a town. He wasn't from one of the big cities. In India at that time, there were basically 2 political models. There were kings, and the kings were the ones who dominated these large states. So there's 16 of them. These are all the ones in capital. These are some of the dominant states. The Kuru state, the Kasi state, all of these were different states. Most of them were run by kings. This one here was a confederacy, which was very interesting. They were really quite democratic to a certain degree, surely for that time. But the point is that the Buddha, he had to travel in this area. And there are 2 states in particular that we want to pay close attention to. One is Magadha. Magadha becomes the political power in the region. The other important state is Kosala. Kosala, as the Buddha grew up, controlled Kapilavastu. Kosala basically incorporated Kapilavastu. Kapilavastu had to pay taxes to them. Kapilavastu had to support their military. This is the other thing about this time in Indian history. Because of iron and because of the incredible wealth that is generated from the trade and from the surplus of agriculture, you have the consolidation of politics. Before that time, especially back under the Aryans and the Indus River, life was very much in villages. But at this time, it moves toward urbanization. And what happens is that kingdoms are developed. And so kings become the norm. When the Buddha grows up, he's basically used to the kings. And he makes it his point to be very, very close to the king of Kosala and his son. And the Buddha spent the last 25 rainy seasons in one of the monasteries here. And there's no question the Buddha wanted to keep on good political relations with the king here because his people, his clan people, were controlled by them ultimately. The other place that he spent a tremendous amount of time, and the greatest number of Buddhist monasteries at the time were built in and around Magadha, around here, which is where the center of political gravity was during and after the Buddha's lifetime. And those of you who are familiar with Emperor Asoka, he's the one that unifies India. I'll get to the map in a minute, but unifies all of India. Everything is out of this power center because of the iron and the economics. This is where some of the religious figures, such as the Buddha, are. So the Buddha makes it his point to become very, very close to the king of Magadha as well. Now, let me try to bring a close to this part of the presentation here by talking specifically about some of the Buddha's politics. One of the things that's interesting is that there's been study about who were his followers. And one scholar, this guy by the name of Gokali, what's his name? Gokali, however you pronounce it. He studied the background of 328 monks. He found that 134 of them were Brahmins, the first tier class. The second, 75, so 134 Brahmins and 75 were the so-called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Kshatriyas, the warrior, the ruler class, the second class. So 134, 75, 98 of them were among the merchants. And then you go down to the fourth class, the servants, the laborers, there's only 11. And then of those who are outcasts, there are only 10. Now, anyways, I was going to say, I had the impression that the Buddha's followers were some of the poorest people in society, but that surely doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, the elite class was basically two classes at this time. There was the warrior class. That's where, Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama came from. That's his class. Those are his people, if you will. They were one and the Brahmins were the other. And the relationship with the two was very codependent. The Brahmins provided sort of spiritual religious guidance. And the second class, the warrior ruler class, they sort of ran the show and they supported one another. And so 64% of his followers were from these elite classes, which is to say 2 out of 3. So 2 out of 3 were, if you will, upper middle class people. And there were very, very rich people at that time. And it was because of the mines. We have the computers and all of that today. There used to be oil, et cetera, in the United States. But now, in those days, it was the mining barons. They were the super, super rich, and they had more money than one could imagine. Anyways, so what we have is a situation of incredible change in India. Buddha is one of many, many teachers who make the rounds. Set up by kings. The Buddha set up his Sangha very much like his own town where he grew up. It was very egalitarian. They tended to make decisions by consensus. And then there were, the local kingdoms. And he was very clear that they were the powers, and he did his best to remain on good terms with them. Now, in terms of his teaching, the Buddha basically was looking at an ethical teaching. And what he talked about, and there was this figure in ancient India called the Kakavati. The Kakavati was what is known as the wheel-turning monarch. And Emperor Asoka was considered to be a Kakavati, or a wheel-turning monarch. And what that meant is that the king ruled based on the Dharma, on the teachings of the Buddha. And what that meant, and the Buddha referred to himself, as well as the kings of his day, as the co-regents or the co-rulers. And he basically lays out and says that you rule by the Buddhist teachings. And let me just read I'll just really quickly through what are called the 10 duties of the king, which are in the Jataka text of the stories of the Buddha's previous lives. And this is sort of the guidelines. Number 1, a king, the ruler, and think about our own presidents and how much these match up. How much these match up in terms of a compassionate ruler, a compassionate president of the United States of America. The 10 duties. Be generous and charitable and not attached to wealth or property. Number two, to be of high moral character. Avoid killing and stealing and adultery. Number three, willing to give up comfort, wealth, and even your life. Number four, be honest. Number five, be kind and gentle in temperament. Number six, be modest and avoid luxury. Number seven, be free from anger and hatred and hold no grudges. Number eight, practice nonviolence and promote peace. Number nine, exhibit patience, tolerance, and take criticism without losing your temper. And number 10, he talks about not practice non-opposition, non-obstruction, which is understood to mean don't get in the way of what people wanted. Another absolutely core piece of the Buddha's take is the fact that the righteous king must have a spiritual life, and that this spiritual life involves, and he lays this out here. He says, number one, to study under a teacher. Number two, to withdraw from time to time, both body and mind, to study the Dharma. He talks about that the ruler should continually study, continually investigate their mind, to review their own practice, review their behavior. Is my behavior wholesome? And to continually ask oneself, what aspects of my life am I clinging to? Is it my feelings, my perceptions, whatever it may be? He goes on to talk about the importance of the relationships between crime and poverty. And to make a long story short, the Buddha tells a variety of stories about the fact that when people are poor, when people are needy, it will lead to crime. And what he basically says is that people need to be provided with the basics of life, what we call the basic needs. And it's not unimportant, which is to say it's important, that in the Sanghas, the Buddha had what was called the four requisites, the four required items, what we would call basic needs, required needs. Every single monk or nun would be provided with medicine, with food, with clothes, and with shelter. And again, sometimes that shelter could mean sleeping under a tree. But the fact is that the monasteries were built over time, and people would always have access to them, especially if they were sick. So let me stop right there and see what you have to say. And let me just quote David Brazier, who wrote this book, The New Buddhism, 2001. He says, the Buddhist teachings had revolutionary implications that would not allow him to live the life prescribed for him by the social dispensation of his day, meaning caste, wealth, political power, prejudice, oppression. What the Buddha was calling for was a revolution of human consciousness that would have this worldly effect both immediately and in the time to come. And so what we have, and again, I apologize for not making the time for this, but you have this King Asoka. To go back to the map very, very quickly. Then we'll ask for questions, comments. At the time of the Buddha, as I said, the country was consolidating in cities, and Magadha was the center. And about 150 years after the Buddha died, things changed dramatically. And the third, we'll call the Mauryan king, this guy, King Asoka, and sometimes it's AS, other times it's ASO, Ashoka. You know, there's Pali, there's Sanskrit, they spell things a little bit differently at times. And basically what happened, and this is very important, I think, for folks to appreciate historically. A lot of the writers talk about the Buddha as a cult. And it doesn't have, and that's not the negative cult. What it means is that he was one of many people that had these very faithful followers One scholar says the number is like 80,000 at the time of his death, 80,000 followers. The Jains, Jains, and their leader Mahavira probably did not have as many, but Mahavira was very, very popular. The Ajivikas were another group, and they're another story. But the point is that Buddhism, if you will, is a local phenomenon until the reign of Ashoka. And what Ashoka does is he becomes the first Indian ruler to basically unify the entire, what becomes the subcontinent. A little bit of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all of India, except for the south. There's some areas in here where he doesn't have control. But basically, Ashoka establishes this empire, and he does it brutally. This guy is brutal of the first order, saying that in the wars against the Kalinga, who were south of where he lived, supposedly 100,000 slaves, 100,000 captured prisoners, many of whom will become slaves, 100,000 people were killed in the process. He has this great revelation that this is messed up. And basically he embraces Buddhism. So he becomes this great emperor. And these edicts here, he writes, this incredible guy, he creates these pillars. They're like 20 to 30 feet high, made of granite or some incredibly hard, and they still exist today. And 7 are really huge. And basically, it's seen, and most scholars say that's the first example of writing in India. And again, the Pali texts, it's believed, were not written down, and that was down in Sri Lanka. That's where they were written, in a monastery there, in 100 BCE. So he's got some writing going on well before any type of mainstream writing. And basically, these pillars tell his history, and they also tell Ashoka's Dharma. So what we know about him is mostly what he wrote about himself. And that's why John Strachan talks about the legend. We don't know if it's true, but it seems to be pretty true, the people who really have studied this. So basically, again, very quickly, Ashoka was powerful. He spread Buddhism. He did not call, Buddhism was not the state religion. He becomes the model. This is very important. He becomes the model for the Theravadan countries in India. And if you go down here, the Theravadan countries, we're talking Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, parts of Laos, the Mahayana, more in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and then the Tibetan sort of Vajrayana in this part of China. But the point is that these countries, including Sri Lanka, this Ashoka becomes the model king for them. It's the Buddhist king who is inspired by the teaching of the Dharma. And of course, many of them did not live up to that reputation, but that was surely the model. So the other piece before we move on to the early next stage is basically says, Ashoka becomes the model. The great writer Nagarjuna talks about politics. You very much support him. And it's safe to say that Ashoka, as well as Nagarjuna, talked about something like a government that we would call welfare socialism, that they provided food, medicine for as much people as possible. They supported all the religions. They were very, very tolerant. They wanted to take care of poor people. They wanted to make sure that basically everyone had basic needs. They really approached this from a basic needs perspective. And again, this would be defined, if you will, as a politics of compassion. So Ashoka becomes that model, becomes the standard for the Theravadan countries in particular, right up until this day, as far as I understand it from what I've read. And I think we can stop right there, and you're incredibly patient. So let's just comments, questions. I've gone much further than I hoped, but that's not new. So.
And if I could step in here, Tom, fortunately we have a group that I can see everybody. So,
Yeah.
so if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, ask Tom to sharpen up a point, you can just wave your hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. Also, and we, Tom and I talked yesterday, we realized we're going a little longer today. We really hope you stick with us because I think we're right at a pivot point here, and Tom sort of set the groundwork, and we're going to, if to use this analogy, we're going to hinge into the modern day, and perhaps not focus on House Resolution number 1 specifically, but bring this up into relevance for us today. So, but my point was going to be, if you do need to take a break, please just do that when you feel like you need to do so. So, if anybody has a comment or a question, this is so rich. I could listen to this for hours. Hi there, Karen. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you want.
I sense that you were feeling a little rushed there at the end, but I didn't quite catch how we went from to the welfare socialism as the Buddhist standard for a state. And I think that's really important. Could you say a little bit more how that trend is important?
It's basically that the Emperor Ashoka and other writers, including Nagarjuna, they want to take care of poor people. They want to take care of people who are sick. They want to make sure that if there is a famine, people have food. The market does not dominate the distribution of wealth. The government takes on a very, if you will, compassionate responsibility to make sure that suffering is mitigated by providing whatever resources they're available. Robert Thurman, the formidable professor, teacher at Columbia and friend of the Dalai Lama, he's very adamant in his writings about this. And, one might take him up on some of this, but the point that he makes is that there is a commitment to basically the most marginalized people in society, and that the government assumes responsibility for providing material resources for them. And that, and again, it's in the form of literally providing food, medicine, support for farmers, financial opportunities for traders. And so, I'll read you here. This is what, what's his name? Robert Thurman says about Ashoka. He calls it, number one, Ashoka's committed to nonviolence. He's committed to religious pluralism. He says that Ashoka provides rest houses and hospices for the poor and the sick. He provides the provision of medicine and doctors for the sick. He supports convicts and their families. And he would free prisoners 25 times, if I read this correctly, 25 times a year on various holidays. He provides support for the families of prisoners. And one of the things I think we need to appreciate is the fact that, what was called kingship, the office of the king or the position of the king at this time in India is taken for granted. I wouldn't say that they're sort of seen as, divine, but they are seen as the rightful inheritors of power, even if they inherit power based on killing the king, which happened all the time. All the time. And once you're the king is able to garner the resources of the kingdom for his purposes. And of course, he hired the army to back that up. And so what we have is that even though Ashoka allowed different parts of the empire to sort of rule themselves with a certain amount of independence, he used the resources of surely his resources to provide for people who were in need. And again, I think, a very simple distinction is to say the market did not determine if poor people were going to get food. It was if they were poor, if they needed food, the government would have provided for them. Does
So-
that make sense, Karen? Please go ahead.
Yes, could I just follow up? So what I'm hearing is that the understanding of interpersonal compassion and the various rules that govern the monasteries, for example, the egalitarianism, to the extent that it became understood that it had to encompass all of the social and community practices as well.
Yes, I mean, that's surely as I would understand it. I think we have to recognize the Sangha was this, a very particular community that had its own rules and so forth, celibacy and all the rest of it. And yet I think the question is, how do we create a society for awakening? And the Sangha itself, the monastery, was clearly that. And, the Buddha was very, very clear about wealth. This is the other thing that's really, there's this wonderful book I read a few years ago. It's one of the Tibetan, I think, teachers, but this book on wealth. And basically what the Buddha says is, according to the canon, is that wealth is not good or bad, but you need to have a certain amount of physical and material well-being in order to wake up spiritually. It's sort of like when he was, in his training and he's eating nothing but pine needles or something, he's about to starve to death. And this, the story goes, the young woman with the cow's milk or goat milk, whatever, the sheep's milk, comes and nourishes him. And it's that nourishment brings him back to health. And that's when he has his enlightenment. And the point is, unless we're materially, physically taken care of, our spiritual life really is not going to develop because we're in such dire straits. How the heck can we sit down and, try to empty our mind?
Mm-hmm. One last thing, would you
Please,
the author that you referred to from Columbia? I couldn't catch it.
Robert Thurman.
Robert Thurman.
Thurman.
Yeah.
And if you want to know a little bit of tidbit stuff that you read in the gossip, is that his daughter is Irma Thurman, which is very interesting. The actress.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you,
Christopher, you've patiently had your electronic hand up there for a while. I hope you're not getting electronically tired, but go ahead and unmute. And,
That's the beauty of the electronic one. You can keep that sucker up forever and it's no harm at all. No, thank you very much for the chance to ask a question. I was really struck in your comments by the degree to which you depicted the Buddha's engagement with the society of his own time as being, I guess you would say, really a pragmatic one. I think you said something about not getting out too far in front of the culture in which he was doing his teaching. Right. And to me, that's a really interesting way to think of the challenge of skillful means, or upaya in Sanskrit, in the sense that it's teaching presumably must be needs to be calibrated to the ear of the listener, and this is probably especially true if you're trying to convey what is I guess in a sense a really revolutionary message. There's the Buddhist allegory of the physician who sort of calibrates the nature and dosage of the medicine to the nature of the illness and the particular circumstances of the patient. And that kind of flexibility strikes me as being a really important piece of any teaching like this. And that may provide a lesson for Buddhist politics in the sense that, I don't know. I don't know if you would agree with this, but at least I would characterize enlightened teaching as being fundamentally, maybe you'd say instrumental in its compassion. It's intended to alleviate suffering and lead listeners towards better wisdom, but it's got to approach engagement with those listeners, which is to say, with the surrounding society, carefully in ways that are tuned to their ears and not overreach or alienate or confuse or whatever else. And is that a lesson? I mean, maybe I'm one of those odd creatures, American Buddhist conservative, and as a fundamentally Burkean thinker when it comes to politics, am I reading too much into your comments to see sort of a real resonance of care and caution and prudence in engaging with people to coax them along rather than to browbeat or pressure?
Yeah, I agree with you what you're saying 100%. I mean, to me, pragmatism, I think, defines how the Buddha approached things. And the question, and upaya by definition is about what will work in terms of skillful means. And, it's interesting, one of the questions that, the author that I find the absolute most compelling is David Loy, L-O-Y. And I also find Stephen Batchelor very compelling.
I agree. They're both wonderful, by the way.
Yeah. And, you know, Loy, they both ask the exact same question. And the question is, what does Buddhism have to offer the world today? And they try to answer it in their own way. And then his response is, if they have nothing to offer, what the hell good is it in many ways, right? If we're not going to make a difference in the world, why the hell are we doing what we're doing? And I think that what both of them have to say is the fact that, well, let me just go back to the Buddha. I mean, the thing is that the Buddha spoke to people of all classes, all different backgrounds, and he was able to speak their language. And, you know, you look at something like the mindfulness movement, which has its critics, and I'm going to put them aside for the moment. But one of the things I talked to both Stephen Batchelor and David Loy about this, and what they basically said is that what Buddhists need to do is put the teachings, the lessons of the Buddha into language that people can understand. Don't talk about, you know, some Sanskrit, this is not about you. Don't use some obscure Sanskrit word to talk to the guy, you know, the folks down the street at your town hall. Put it in the language that counts. And I think this is what they say, the challenge that we who want to use Buddhist principles to bring about less suffering, more compassion, more kindness, loving kindness in society, our job, and this is what I'm trying to figure out, you know, and I have a long way to go, and I approach this with great humility, is that I'm trying to figure out how the hell do you translate this into common language so that you don't have to be a Buddhist or know anything about Buddhism to actually learn from what we can say. And so, so everything you're saying, I would agree with 100%. You know, yeah. I mean, the question is, you know, as a political scientist, it's sort of like, it's very easy from the outside to sort of say, this is what you should do. Great, right? In the backseat of the car, you say, this is how you should drive the car. When you're actually in the position of power, and I'll just say this about politics, when you talk about being president of the United States or the governor or any really major politician, there are two choices all the time, as far as I can see. There's the bad choice, and then there's the worst choice. Because in order to get anything done, you need to compromise, but you're going to compromise on things that you really don't want to compromise on. You know, Obama and the public option, right? For a lot of us, the public option was absolutely indispensable in terms of a higher vision, if you will. But if the reality on the ground in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, in fact, was that a public option may kill it, then you let go of the public option. And so it's, you know, it's not the perfect, it's sort of what can be done. So, you know, I agree with you. You know, some people may not agree with me, but I'm with you in terms of like, but it doesn't mean that you can't you can't present the idea of this is a politics of loving each other. You know, the other title for this is a politics of compassion, is this is a politics of loving your neighbor. I'm a good Irish Catholic kid. You know, I went to church every Sunday with my 7 siblings and my mother. Love your neighbor is something that, you know, this is very real to me. Thanks, Christopher.
Tom, I'm not sure how long your next session is, but maybe
It's
we'll
not as
take Grant's
long.
question.
Not as long.
Let's take Grant's question, and then we'll move into your next part, because I think we have a hard stop at the top of the hour.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see you. Tom, I resonate with what you're saying. Of course, I resonate with Chris's perspective, being one of those rare birds myself. I'm remembering when you said Green River, I forgot I think of Green River as Eve's Sangha. So if you'd said Eve's Sangha, then I would have resonated with it. So
yeah,
yes, I remember, and we had a nice chat afterwards.
Yeah,
I'm saying the same thing now, or just pick up on what you said about finding the right words, which is one of the reasons why I love Zen Peacemakers and Bernie's simple teachings of the 3 tenets. And what I have found is when I walk the halls of Congress or when I'm trying to lobby locally or whatever, right. Climate's my primary gig, a race now part of it. keeping those three tenets in front of every moment is the best way. And I find when I speak with people about how to lobby, how to deal with politicians, how difficult it is to deal with the other party. I mean, it's typically the what's the usual suspect is the other party for most of the people that I'm speaking to in the Buddhist world. But it's just, approach with that compassion, as you said, but really approach with the three tenets. If you go into the conversation with someone of the other party and you've already prejudged the stupidity of their opinion and the necessity to change that opinion, you're not, that's not upaya. That's not skillful. So I appreciate the history. I learned stuff today, and that's always great. I want to check that box every day, learn something. So that you added to the history, and I would just put another plug in for David Loy and
awesome.
Stephen Batchelor, both of whom do a great job of covering history. But if I had learned about the importance of iron, I had forgotten it. So thanks for reminding me of that. So nice to have you here.
Thank you, Grant. I agree with everything you're saying. And it's interesting, one of the questions is, what does Buddhism have to offer? And it's interesting. I mean, in terms of analyzing our problems, we could use the Four Noble Truths, right? There's problem, there's a cause, there's a way out, and here's the way out. The three tenets is like not knowing, is sort of observing, paying attention here, what's up, I really don't know. But bearing witness is like, here's the reality, here we go. And what do I do about it? Well, whatever the heck I do, number one is that I can't be attached to it. And number two, I got to be loving and compassionate when I carry it out. And I love what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I would add, whatever you do, you need to bear witness to what happens, what you did. And if it didn't work out too well, then you need to bear witness again without knowing why, and perhaps change your approach. The other thing I just want to add that Bernie always said, and I think so many people in the political world forget this consistently, happily, is the sense of oneness. And when you look at the other party again, when you look at the other race, or you look at the other of any kind, they are us and we are them, not one, not two. And walking with that very simple teaching of oneness, I think, is critical in all parts of life, but particularly in politics.
I agree 100%. Yeah.
Thanks, Grant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Tom, why don't we move into your next section? And
so thank you for your patience. Thank you for, as usual, my longer than planned presentation here. This won't be that long, as long, I should say. So, I mean, it's interesting that over the last, 2000 plus years in Asia, that Buddhism has been a defining aspect of those countries. So by definition, they have been political. And it seems from my recent reading that those particular Theravada countries, where this idea of the sort of Dharmic king, is very real there and more present. Whereas in the other countries, they may have been Buddhist, but the idea of the role of the king or the emperor taking that on as well is not as powerful. And I don't pretend to know that history well, and yet I find it really interesting. The other thing I want to say is that, Buddhism, especially in India, seemed to be dormant for like 1,000 years. And as a result of British colonialism, it really came to life. And there's some really interesting figures. This fellow Dharmapala is one in the mid 1800s, who was one of them. And make a long story short, he really brings Buddhism back to a certain extent. And Ambedkar, the great figure in the mid 1900s, in his support of the Dalits in India, is also a formidable presence in history. But so there is the reality of a couple thousand years of Buddhist presence in Asia, very powerful at times, under attack at other times. The nuns of Asia have had a terrible struggle in a lot of the Theravada countries to even be able to have full ordination, have their own monasteries or nunneries. It's a huge challenge. And we see today in different places. You know, we see the nationalism in Sri Lanka, in the civil war there. We see what's going on in Burma in terms of the politics against the Rohingya, I'm not pronouncing it, the Rohingya folks there. And, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi's, you know, the, what was she called? Not the Great Mother. Anyways, but, you know, she was this sort of iconic figure for a lot of us. And it seems that she's backing the military and the oppression of the Rohingya is, you know, the politics. So anyways, that's a part of the world where Buddhist politics is real. And it's going on every day. It's been going on for 1,000 years. And in many ways, that's a little bit different story because I'm focusing on the United States. You know, I lived in Japan for a couple of years. I've traveled throughout most of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, through much of India. You know, anyways, but, you know, I don't live there. And so I don't pretend to know much about it really, other than the fact that it's very powerful and present. So let's jump to the United States of America. Here we are today. Here are just a couple of quotes that I want to start off. Gary Snyder, many of you probably know this. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been individual insight into the basic self, the basic void. We need both. And in many ways, this is my sort of guide. If you want to be, by the Dalai Lama, if you want to be happy, be compassionate. If you want others to be happy, be compassionate. And I think that this is true. For my own life, this is true. And I don't know if this is the motto of this kind of politics, but I think in real life it actually holds. Let me present a quote. Larry Ward, African-American Dharma teacher, PhD, Dr. Larry Ward. I quote, "Our racial suffering is deep and wide. It is a particular kind of samsara, repeated cycles of bitterness, pain, and fear. It is sustained by our conditioning, both individual and collective. It is the undercurrent of a failed paradigm of aggression, ownership of peoples, and enduring institutionalized racism. This failed paradigm of view presents us with a profound opportunity to rebuild the shape of our thinking, speech, and action as we can and must redefine what it means to be a human being." So in many ways, these are a real guide to my own thinking. So many of you are acutely aware, I know, of this phenomenon we call engaged Buddhism. You know, ZPI is, most folks I imagine would consider themselves part of that movement. And let me just share a couple things about it and then present what my sense of some type of a paradigm is, a bunch of principles around this. So Christopher Queen lives not too far from Green River here. I'm in Vermont, they're in Massachusetts, but engaged Buddhism, he talks about as the basically the new vehicle. B.R. Ambedkar, and again, I don't want to be presumptuous. Ambedkar, it's Ambedkar, Ambedkar. He was a Dalit born in India, brilliant guy. Someone gave, you know, the situation of Dalits in India is beyond our imagination. You know, the reading I've been doing is that in a lot of the schools, I don't know if it's still, but it wasn't that long ago. Alan Sanuki, who was one of the teachers I did the chaplaincy program at Upaya Zen Center with Joan Halifax and Alan Sanuki and a bunch of other folks. Anyways, so he was one of the main teachers there, and we talked to him a lot. And Ambedkar is his guy. And Alan does wonderful work. He was the president, head of the Buddhist Peace Network. And anyways, Ambedkar was given an opportunity to go to school. But what Alan writes about not too long ago is that the Dalit children have to stay outside the school in some of the villages, have to stay outside the schoolroom. They have to take their lessons outside. It's because the folks inside, the other classes, don't want them near them to touch them. They're literally untouchable. And the children take their classes outside of the classroom. And because it's so hot, they have a window and they have to look through. That's how horrible it is. Anyways. And Benkar gets a couple PhDs, lives in the United States, lives in Britain, comes back, helps to write the Constitution, and dies tragically in the mid-1950s. But basically, he helped to convert something like 300,000 Dalits in one thing to become Buddhists. And so there is a Dalit presence of Buddhism, and basically they feel that Hinduism doesn't serve them well at all because of the caste system. Anyways, Ambedkar committed his life to trying to improve the Dalits and was a remarkable guy and very great reading. Anyways, Ambedkar, who he is. But what he talked about engaged Buddhism, or he talked about the new vehicle. And it was basically what Christopher Queen talks about is basically a new paradigm for Buddhist liberation, what we call engaged Buddhism. And he defines it as the application of the Dharma or Buddhist teachings to the resolution of social problems. And he goes on and talks about it as the fourth vehicle after Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and now what Ambedkar called Navayana, the new vehicle. It's the goal of alleviating suffering, a commitment to human rights, social justice, political activism, due process. It's the Bodhisattva commitment to save all beings, and the creation, this is very important, creation of new social institutions and relationships. So it's the quest for, this is the Bodhisattva vow, right? A quest for individual liberation combined with the commitment to ease social suffering. Bodhisattva politics. Sally King, another scholar, says that engaged Buddhists have four principles that they go by: nonviolence, compassion, loving kindness, and a search for an outcome that benefits all. In terms of Asia, who are some of the activists? Dharmapala, this guy in the mid-1800s in India. Ambedkar, we talked about. A.T. Ari Yuratne in the Savrodaya movement in Sri Lanka. Incredible, incredible. You know, you build the self as you build the road. Incredible teachings there. Buddha Dasa, whom I'm going to talk about very briefly, out of Thailand. Sulak Sivaraksa, another Thai, very brave, in many ways radical guy. Soka Gakkai in Japan, incredibly popular in terms of social services. There are nuns throughout Asia doing work. And again, the great Maha Ghosananda out of Cambodia. This is a guy, the Khmer Rouge killed literally his entire family and a lot of the people he knew. And he started this whole process of reconciliation and what are called the Great Peace Walks in Cambodia. Remarkable, remarkable guy. The Dalai Lama, you know, how does this guy get up and smile in the morning when you look at what the Chinese have done? The level of violence of what China has done to Tibet is absolutely breathtaking. And it's interesting that I was in China, I don't know, let's say 8 years ago, and I talked to a whole bunch of Chinese young people, lovely, I mean, it was spectacular. They all spoke English, and literally none of them knew anything about Tibet. Nothing, and I mean nothing. The only thing they knew is that you go on vacation in Tibet. That was it. They knew nothing about it. And the fact that the Dalai Lama is able to basically, you know, forgive these folks. So the Dalai Lama, let me just walk through. So I want to talk about the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh. Some of you know these well, so it may be a little bit redundant. And then I'm just going to jump to sort of a general, and then I'm really eager to hear what people have to say about this. We'll talk a little bit more about the economy and about climate change. The Dalai Lama says, he says, world peace will never come as long as self-interest. And a lot of them talk, it's very simple. Be selfish or be unselfish. As long as self-interest is the sole basis upon which politics is carried out. The new approach to global problems he calls universal responsibility. So instead of self-interest, and it's interesting, you know, Ken Wilber is a brilliant guy. I don't pretend to understand him all the time, but he's written a couple of really interesting books about Buddhism. And one of his books, he talks about the people's politics, and this really taught me a lot. He says that people who live in a village, their politics don't really extend beyond the village because that's what they know. Those are the people they know. And you compare those folks to the so-called cosmopolitan crowd, meaning that those who have traveled all over the world, they've lived in foreign countries, they've learned foreign languages, they've sort of seen the world. And that the difference politically is that for the folks who have gone nowhere beyond the village, their politics would be very conservative and very sort of narrow because that's the only world that they know. But those who travel and see the world, who study and so forth, they actually can identify. You know, if you lived in China for 2 years, or you lived in, you know, Burma for 2 years, and you read about all the violence, it's like, oh my God, all those people who I knew and come to love, they're suffering. But the average person in the world who grew up in the village, they couldn't find Burma on the map. How can they like worry about things that they don't know? And so one of the things that, you know, the Dalai Lama talks about is universal responsibility. And that's interesting and a huge challenge, because if your universe is nothing but your village and like your clan, then that's where your responsibility is. If your universe is the whole wide world because you happen to be exposed to it, that's different. So how to sort of bridge that, I think, is a very interesting question. He talks about, instead of self-interest, why he talks about wise self-interest, but I think even is mutual interest. And the idea is very simply is that, and again, all you have to do, look at the pandemic, look at the financial crisis in 2008, look at climate change, is that how can I separate my interest from your interest? And I think the answer is more and more, you know, Buddha's basic teaching of interdependency and co-arising reality, I think really resonates. Dalai Lama agrees that leaders need a spiritual life. And it's interesting, he claims that he's half a Marxist. And we could talk about what that means from if one were to get into Marxism. We don't have time today for that, but it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that, anyways, Marxism involves a number of things. I'm not sure, you know, I'm talking about Marx, not the sort of popular version. I'm talking about what Marx actually said. I'm not sure the Dalai Lama would go there. That's why maybe he calls it he's half a Marxist. And he talks, it's interesting, he says that socialism and internationalism, he finds are consistent with his principles. He said that if he were to vote, he would vote probably for one of the environmental parties. Now, it is true that the Dalai Lama has been criticized for his relationship with China. He hasn't been as public about certain things like the invasion of Iraq as some people would like. But his policies are pretty clear: pragmatism, nonviolence, democracy, human rights, respect for the so-called enemies, what we might call simply opponents, dialogue, respect for the environment, all within a framework of love and kindness. Thich Nhat Hanh, many of you know very well, Vietnamese teacher, had a stroke a couple of years ago, is alive as far as I know. Just unbelievable mind and prolific writer, teacher. Any of you have had some of you have been in the presence of both of these people, and it is remarkable. He famously says, Buddhism, there are those who argue that Buddhists should not get involved in politics. That's very clear, especially in, more conservative traditional folks in different countries. And he doesn't accept that argument. He basically says Buddhism is already engaged Buddhism. If it is not, it is not Buddhism. In his wisdom and insight, Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of interbeing, I think, is just an incredibly powerful idea. And the more that we think about, when two people stand next to each other, that the atoms in our skin are interacting with the air and our breath and our hair, and is traveling, and they're interacting with the atoms in the other persons, and realizing that we're both breathing the same air, and that in many ways, or it's like, and that we are connected, or if it's like the piece of paper, the piece of paper, which comes from the wood, which is nourished by the water and by the sun and by the soil and by the person who processes it, who needs to feed, and the truck driver and the person in the staple store where you buy your paper. All of those people are connected to this and to me. In terms of Thich Nhat Hanh, again, his policy of mindfulness. This is very much, I love what Grant talked about in terms of lobbying, is that, to be mindful of ourselves at all time. How, as we, is there the other? For people who don't like Donald Trump and they say, well, how can these people vote for him? The question is, can we see ourselves in Donald Trump supporters? And my question is, am I Donald Trump? And my answer to that question, am I Tom Redden, Donald Trump? The answer is hell yeah, I am Donald Trump. Because there is a part of me that he and I share. There are other parts, maybe not. But the idea of non-separation, and again, David Lloyd will talk a little bit later, is about, the depth of our spiritual practice as meditators, as emptying ourselves of our ego, as emptying ourselves of our opinion, of emptying ourselves of our belief that we're right and they're wrong, and to simply be present in this moment, mindfully, and with the open heart, with compassion. The person that you're lobbying on the other side of the table that votes contrary to you every single time, the person on television who's saying these outrageous things, are they actually separate from us? And I think our practice says no. It's not to say that we don't stand up for what we believe in, but we don't create dualism in the world simply because of our opinions. So Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of interbeing and mindfulness, to me, represent very, very powerful tools for all of us. Aung San Suu Kyi, she wrote some fabulous books, and I've read, a fair amount about her being basically apologist for the Burmese militaries and Buddhist violence against these poor folks. But her books have been fabulous. And, I'll just say one thing that I found interesting. I was reading about Burma about 200 years ago. And the debate at that time, I'm not sure exactly where British colonialism was at the time, but it's in the colonial, European imperialism is alive and well in Asia, and Burma was in the middle of it at one level or another. And the question was, in light of that, to be Burmese, did that mean that you were a Buddhist? And there were those who argued to be Burmese means you're a Buddhist. And I have a sense that in Sri Lanka, that, for a lot of people, that's exactly how they see it, which would have propelled the, much of the Civil War. And so the debate 200 years ago, if it was, gee, I'm Burmese and therefore a Buddhist, I wonder if there is such an ingrained sense of identity and culture that Aung San Suu may have that we never saw. That to be Burmese as a Buddhist, I mean, it sounds heretical because she was this iconic figure, but I don't know how to explain it. Some people say that we never knew her. It was one thing when she was, limited to her house. It's another thing when you're in power. And again, I'll come back to what I said before. You have two choices. One's a bad choice and one's a worse choice. So who knows what choices she said? I don't know. Anyways, what she talked about is that one of the things that moved me is she said, regime change is not the issue, as in Burma. This is while she was still under house arrest. She said she says that the revolution that she talked about, the significant change, she said, is not the change of government, she says, but a change of values. And I'll quote her here. She says, regime change can be temporary, but value change is a long-term sound foundation for change. Even if there's regime change, if these basic values have not changed, then one regime change can lead to another regime change, and so on and so on. So let me just jump to what I found really interesting. Buddhadasa, this is a guy in Thailand, the mid-1900s. And he created this community there, did a lot of writing. And one of the things he said that totally captured me, he had a redefinition for spiritual. He said that spiritual included, I mean, a lot of us would say spiritual is, that which unites us, or maybe that beyond the body. Bernie gave me a definition once of spiritual is, recognizing, to acknowledge and to recognize the oneness of all things. That's what spirituality is about. What Buddhadasa says is that spiritual includes the material, physical, and social. He says that the Theravadins speak about mind and, the body and the mind/heart in terms of dualism. And he says the spiritual does not exclude the body, does not exclude politics, does not exclude society, does not exclude economics. And I love this next quote from him. He says, democracy is a moral rather than a political issue. I'll say it again. Democracy is a moral rather than a political issue. And I love the next sentence. Only selfish people treat politics as a matter of power. Only selfish people treat politics as a matter of power. So he goes on to talk about what he calls dharmic socialism, which is very interesting. And I'll summarize his writings by saying, he says, the basis is the common good comes first, that society is more fundamental than the individual, that the interest and needs of society are, as a whole, come before those of the individual. And he says that we have a social contract in which we recognize that society gives us what we have, and we have a responsibility and a duty to society. End quote. That's a very challenging and interesting perspective for a lot of Americans. Society comes first. My sort of paradigm for compassionate politics / the politics of loving your neighbor. We understanding we are all committed to happiness. Number 2, compassion is the primary motivator in politics. Those who go into it, and when decisions are made, compassion is the driving force. Equality for every human being in a radical way, racial, all sorts of identities. Number 4, a politics of compassion that seeks to eliminate or mitigate suffering is committed to meeting basic needs: food, shelter, medicine, clothing, we would call education. A lot of us, it would include jobs at one level or another. at that point, some would include culture. We'd have to work at what are the basics for all Americans today. And what I'm waiting for is the politician who says, I commit myself to a country, to an America in which no children go hungry. I commit myself to a country, to an America in which no children sleep on the street. I commit myself to that every child, when any child, every child in the United States of America is sick, is that they have access to health care. That a politician that commits themselves to both children and their parents and their grandparents, these very, very basic, and that's a way to go. People talk about socialism. Number 5 is, I would say, universality. This is interesting, the debate around socialism, the Green New Deal. The fact is, Americans believe in public education. We believe in Social Security. We believe in workers' compensation. We believe in unemployment insurance. Almost all of us believe in that. That's what you call socialism in a sort of very sort of basic way. You pay your taxes and everybody pays their taxes. Everybody gets the services. Can that, and here's the question, will it apply to healthcare? Can that apply to childcare? And it's a fundamental question. Can we get to where we need without healthcare and childcare? I just don't see it. The thing of the pandemic, guaranteed income, a very interesting question. I have read a bit about it. I know, it would be lovely. Does it make sense? I don't know. This is a challenging one. Number 6, our leaders are committed to a spiritual life, whatever that looks like. Nagarjuna wrote in the early, after the Common Era, he says that the unenlightened or egotistical, defensive, overly ambitious leader will carry out unenlightened, egotistical, defensive, and overly ambitious policies, and that will lead to more suffering. So this is a very interesting, challenging question. Do we want a philosopher king running the show? And I don't mean necessarily a European model of that. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the means are the ends. Can you lie your way to power? Can you cheat your way to power? Can you trick people to power? And he's saying means are ends. Our approach needs to be non-ideological, neither of the left, neither of the right. And again, it needs to be pragmatic. And again, the model is the Bodhisattva model of looking compassionately to all problems. No enemies, call them opponents, call them what you will, pursue a policy of non-harming. And again, for me, the issue is the climate crisis and the economy that is endlessly productive, endlessly consuming, and endlessly taking resources from the planet, putting pollution back out there. And the question is, how are we going to survive unless we change that? I think the answer is it's not going to be pretty. And so, this model that more is better, that wealth equals happiness, that production and consumption endlessly is the right that we all have. The problem is that the stakes are simply too high for us, and I mean the government. The final thing about the government is that I don't think the government policies can make us happy. I think the government policies can reduce suffering in society. If we have 29 million people who have no health insurance, those people are going to suffer terribly. If they are all of a sudden covered by some type of government insurance, which covers veterans and the elderly and people of certain income and disabilities, if they were all covered, they would mitigate suffering in a profound way. So you've been incredibly patient with my long-windedness here. Let me stop there. It's been a pleasure. And the door is open. The floor is open.
Yeah, we have just inside of 10 minutes here. If anybody has a question or a comment or something to add, we can do so, or if not, we can close.
And I'm really looking for suggestions, thoughts that you think may be helpful as I think about this. This is very much in process, so. Hi, Karen.
I just wanted to note that, you know, my Lakota teachers will say, Mitako Yasa, which means all my relations. And to broaden our care and compassion so that in our language, we acknowledge our compassion for all other beings and the earth herself.
Yep.
It's really important to me.
Yep.
So, but thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
I'm curious, Karen, do you have language? I mean, are there language around that you find helpful? I love what you say about all my relations. That's a beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the
That's
that's the
great.
prayer. Yeah, I would maybe if you haven't read Robin Wall Kimmerer, her book Braiding Sweetgrass.
Braiding.
Sweetgrass.
Yep.
It has a subtitle. It's something like Indigenous Wisdom and something in the Life of Plants. But she, like other language that she uses, is the idea of mutual flourishing, which
Great.
I love.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And also she talks about the principle of an honorable harvest.
Lovely.
You know, one of my elders told me a story of going hunting, for example, for a deer and waiting, and all the deer go past and all the deer go past. And then one stops and looks at him. And he says, that means I am willing to sacrifice my life
Wow.
for your life.
Beautiful.
And, you know, that sort of understanding that we're all in a kinship relationship with each other would transform away from that exploitive capitalist idea that it's just here for us to dominate,
Right.
you know, the whole notion of domination. So those are a couple of thoughts that come.
Lovely. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Hi, Lily.
Sorry, wrong button. So I have many questions, but the time is short. So I will come to the one that's most interesting for me right now. Is how do we change politics as Buddhists? My first idea now after this talk is becoming a politician. But so I mean, because in most ways, as I know my Buddhist sanghas, is we work on a micro level.
Yeah.
But how do we work on a macro level? How do we change on a systemic level? Do we protest? Is protesting being one, is showing our solidarity, I think, is being one. But what do we do with like the real shit stuff in the world? What do we do with breaches of human rights? How do we go against this and still being in the oneness?
Yeah. You know, thank you for the question. And I think that's a question that we're all asking ourselves. And I ask myself that very question: what should I be doing now in light of what's going on? You know, I mean, from a political perspective, I think they're all the things that we know very well, is that, you know, we have elections and that makes a difference, and everything that goes into that, we know that. You know, and the question is, you know, so there's that. And then there's obviously organizing is what politics is about. At least in the United States, I'd argue that the Republicans have out-organized the Democrats for the last 40 or 50 years in terms of their use of money and all this other stuff. They've been very, very smart in terms of their message. And a lot of that had to do with, you know, just out organizing the Democrats. I think that there's so many levels at which politics takes place. You know, to a certain extent, you know, how we raise our children is a very political question. And for a lot of people, their politics has to do with being a parent. For other people, you know, so I've been a teacher my whole life. You know, my politics has been as a parent. I've been an activist in many ways for a number of years, but my politics is mostly through teaching. and learning and being able to sort of share what I've learned, all in the effort of trying to, change the world in a more loving and compassionate way. I appreciate what Grant does as a lobbyist. This is really, really, I mean, for most people, really hard work. I don't want to be a lobbyist, I'd rather be in front of, 10 or 100 students than, I mean, not that it wouldn't be interesting and so forth. But there are those, for whom should be doing that. So, there's so many levels at which politics takes place. If politics in many ways is about power, where are the levers of power? And what you're saying is exactly right, is that the question is a systemic level. The healthcare system, the fact is it's a public-private. The fact that the richest country in the world has 30 million Americans who have no access to health insurance it's almost unbelievable from a moral perspective, in my opinion. And there is the system, but that system is connected to our electoral political system. And we have an electoral system that private money is involved in our elections as well as public money. The climate change. I mean, I read a number that something like the Koch brothers, who are this very, very super rich folks, energy company, supposedly since 1982, don't quote me, I have it somewhere here, they spent something like $600 million. $600 million. Supposedly they have a bigger political operation than both the Democratic and the Republican parties. So, the system there is a system in which private money has a huge impact. And for some people, that's fine. I don't have any trouble if it's to a moderate level, but I think it's been extreme. So, it's a question that, I'd have to spend an hour and we'd have to collectively spend an hour to answer. One of the ways that I think about how I can make a difference is a quote. This is a paraphrasing of someone much wiser than I. And the quote is basically, is that figure out where your heart is broken and follow that. Follow where your broken heart is. And for me, that a lot of it was poverty for a long time. My beloved my children have educated us. And again, I've been dealing with all the issues, but in terms of my number one is that race is, in the last 5 years is always an issue, but has even taken more importance, and obviously the last year or so. And now the climate change, the climate, and again, it's only been 5, this is the one thing, the Buddhist leaders around the world, if everything I'm reading, this is the issue. And it's because it's an existential issue that's going to have the greatest suffering in the long run. And it doesn't matter what part of the world the Buddhist leaders are. It seems to me that climate change really is the single most important. And I take that to heart. Thank you for the question. I know that was not adequate.
Thank you, Tom. I would love to spend that hour talking about it.
Well, maybe sometime we can.
Tom, we're getting very close, but Franziska has her hand up. So Franziska, if we can take a short question and a short answer, we will just squeak in before the...
Thank you. Hi,
yeah, thank you. So yeah, time passed. Thank you very much. It was so interesting, and really there will be so many issues to talk about, to continue.
Yeah.
I just want to point to two issues. One thing is that the 3 tenets are really very, very important to me, and I think they are so easy to understand.
Yes.
Also for people who are not Buddhist, they have not a special spiritual practice.
Yeah.
So I think this is so powerful. And what you also said about the value that we have to give to the earth and about climate change. I'm just sharing that in Switzerland, we will have a group of people who organize a march during 5 weeks from one part of Switzerland to the other one. And every evening there will be discussions and workshops at the station where these people stay, and it's possible to join. There are so many young people joining also this movement, and
Yep.
this is so powerful when young people
That's awesome.
make and create these actions.
That's great. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Let me ask you a quick question. Do you know who Jean Ziegler is in Switzerland? Politician? Oh, no. Okay. He's a well-known person there. He was one of my professors there, but anyways.
Okay.
Okay, perfect, everyone, and thank you. And we started off. We have about half of where we started, but we still have Germany, Switzerland, Brazil, and the United States and Colorado represented.
I want to thank you, and thank you for your patience with the length of the presentation today. And Jeff, it's been a total pleasure.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Tom, so much for this, and thanks everybody for sticking with us for 2 hours.